The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty plains of Arizona Territory, baking the cracked earth until it shimmered under the relentless heat. Elias Thorne, a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited, weathered, tough and unforgiving, rode his aging roan mare, Betsy, towards the meager cluster of buildings that constituted the town of Redemption. It wasn't a place he frequented, preferring the solitary company of his ranch a hard day's ride away. But supplies were low, and even a man who sought solitude couldn't conjure beans and bullets from thin air. Elias was a study in grim practicality. His clothes were faded and worn, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by sun and hardship. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a perpetual watchfulness, a habit ingrained by years spent first in the brutal theater of the Civil War and then in the isolating vastness of the West. He spoke little, saw much, and expected less. Life had taught him that reliance on others was a fool's errand. As he neared a bend in the barely discernible track that served as a road, a small, still form caught his eye. It was huddled by the side of the path, a pathetic bundle of rags against the unforgiving backdrop of the desert. Elias, despite his ingrained desire to avoid entanglement, felt a reluctant tug of curiosity. He reined Betsy to a halt, the mare snorting softly in the oppressive silence. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. As he approached, the bundle stirred, and a small, dirty face peered up at him, wide-eyed and filled with a terror that went beyond the mere surprise of a stranger's presence. The child, a boy no older than 10, was thin and bruised, his clothes tattered remnants of what might once have been decent attire. A raw, weeping gash marred his left cheek. "Get away," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling, as if speaking caused him pain. He tried to scramble further away, but his small body seemed weak and unresponsive. Elias knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, trying not to appear threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you, son," he said, his voice rough from disuse but surprisingly gentle. The boy flinched as if struck by the words themselves. His eyes darted to Elias's hands, then to the worn leather holster at his hip. Are you going to hit me with the whip too?" he asked, the question barely audible, laced with a heartbreaking mixture of fear and resignation. The words struck Elias like a physical blow. The casual mention of such brutality, directed at a child, ignited a cold fury within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his own emotions in check. "I don't have a whip," he stated simply, holding out his calloused hands, palms open, to show he was unarmed. The boy remained wary, his gaze fixed on Elias. After a long, tense moment, a flicker of something akin to uncertainty crossed his features. "What's your name, son?" Elias asked, his voice low and even. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Ethan." "Ethan," Elias repeated softly. "Well, Ethan, it looks like you're in a bad way. How long have you been out here?" Ethan didn't answer, his eyes downcast. Elias could see the faint outline of ribs beneath his torn shirt. Hunger and exhaustion were etched into every line of his small body. "Come on," Elias said, his decision made. He reached out slowly, and after a moment's hesitation, Ethan allowed himself to be helped to his feet. He was light as a feather. "Let's get you out of this, son." He lifted the boy onto Betsy's back, settling him as comfortably as possible in front of the saddle. Ethan remained stiff and silent, his small hands clutching the reins with a desperate grip. Elias mounted behind him, his large frame a stark contrast to the boy's fragility. As Betsy began to move, Ethan flinched again, his body tensing. "Easy now," Elias murmured, his hand resting lightly on the boy's back. "She won't hurt you." The ride back to the ranch was slow and uneventful. Ethan remained silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Elias stole glances at the boy, his mind churning. Who would abandon a child like this, and what had happened to him to instill such deep-seated fear? He knew he was taking on more trouble than he could likely handle, but looking at the boy's battered form, he couldn't bring himself to leave him by the side of the road. Something in Ethan's eyes, a flicker of resilience beneath the terror, had touched a long dormant chord within him. He was a solitary man accustomed to his own company, but in that moment, With the small, fragile boy held against him, a strange sense of responsibility began to take root. The ranch house was small and functional, built by Elias's own hands years ago. It consisted of a single main room with a stone fireplace, a small lean-to that served as a kitchen, and a narrow loft where he slept. It was a bachelor's dwelling, spare and uncluttered, and certainly not equipped for a child. As Elias carried Ethan inside, the boy's eyes, still wide with apprehension, scanned the room. It was dimly lit, the only light filtering through the small window. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and wood smoke. Elias gently set Ethan down on the worn wooden bench by the fireplace. The boy sat stiffly, his gaze darting around as if expecting danger to lurk in every shadow. "I'll get you some water," Elias said, his voice calm. He went to the water barrel in the corner and poured a dipper full, offering it to Ethan. The boy hesitated for a moment before taking it with trembling hands and drinking greedily. While Ethan drank, Elias surveyed him more closely. The bruises on his arms and legs were more pronounced now, and the gash on his cheek looked raw and inflamed. It was clear the boy had suffered. "I need to clean that cut," Elias said, gesturing to the injury. Ethan flinched, pulling away. "No, don't touch it." "It will get infected if I don't," Elias explained patiently. "It will hurt worse then." After a moment of tense silence, Ethan nodded slowly. His eyes filled with a mixture of fear and trust. Elias fetched a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. He approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice as he gently cleaned the wound. Ethan winced but didn't cry out. Once the cut was clean, Elias rummaged through his meager supplies and found a small tin of salve. He applied it carefully to the gash. "There," he said when he was finished. "That should help." Ethan looked up at him, his expression unreadable. It was as if he couldn't quite reconcile the rough exterior of this man with the unexpected gentleness of his touch. Next, Elias turned his attention to the boy's hunger. He had some dried beef and hardtack biscuits. It wasn't much, but it was food. He offered it to Ethan, who devoured it with a desperate hunger that tugged at Elias's heart. As Ethan ate, Elias stoked the fire in the hearth. The evening was beginning to cool, and the small room offered little in the way of insulation. He watched the boy, his mind still wrestling with the questions of who he was and what he had been through. When Ethan had finished eating, he looked up at Elias, his eyes filled with a weariness that belied his young age. Where am I?" he asked softly. "You're at my ranch," Elias replied. "You're safe here." The word safe seemed foreign to Ethan. He looked around the small cabin again, as if searching for an escape route. "What's going to happen to me?" he asked, his voice laced with anxiety. Elias hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He only knew that he couldn't leave this child to fend for himself. "You can stay here for now," he said finally. "We'll figure things out." Ethan didn't respond, but a flicker of relief seemed to cross his face before being quickly masked by his usual apprehension. As the night deepened, Elias made a makeshift bed for Ethan on a pile of blankets near the fireplace. The boy curled up, his small frame still tense. Elias watched him for a long time, the flickering firelight casting long shadows on the walls. He thought of his own childhood, a stark contrast to the hardship this boy had already endured. He had known love and security, things that seemed utterly absent from Ethan's young life. He banked the fire and climbed up to his loft bed. Lying in the darkness, the unfamiliar presence in the room below felt both intrusive and strangely comforting. He was a man who had sought solitude, but tonight the silence felt a little less heavy, the loneliness a little less profound. He had taken in a stray, a wounded creature in need of shelter. He wasn't sure why he had done it, but as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that his life had irrevocably changed. The first few days were a delicate dance of tentative trust and ingrained fear. Ethan remained wary, flinching at sudden movements and speaking only when necessary, his voice barely above a whisper. He clung to the edges of the room, observing Elias with a constant, watchful gaze. Elias moved slowly and deliberately around the boy, making sure his actions were predictable and non-threatening. He spoke to Ethan in a calm, even tone, answering his hesitant questions patiently and never pressing him for information about his past. He offered simple kindnesses, A warm blanket, extra food, a gentle word, letting Ethan come to him at his own pace. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boy began to relax. He started venturing out of his corner, watching Elias as he went about his daily chores. He would sit quietly by the fire while Elias mended fences or cleaned his rifle, his eyes following the rancher's every move. One morning, Elias was splitting firewood outside when he noticed Ethan standing hesitantly in the doorway, clutching a small whittled piece of wood. "What's that?" Elias asked, pausing his work. Ethan held it out shyly. It was a rough carving of a bird, its wings slightly lopsided, but its form recognizable. I made it," Ethan mumbled, his gaze fixed on the ground. Elias took the carving, turning it over in his calloused hands. It was crude, but showed a spark of creativity. "It's good, Ethan," he said honestly. "You have a knack for this." A faint blush crept up Ethan's cheeks. It was the first time Elias had seen him show any sign of pride. Over the next few days, Ethan began to spend more time outside, still keeping a safe distance but venturing further from the cabin. He would watch the squirrels scamper through the trees and the birds soar overhead, a flicker of curiosity replacing the constant fear in his eyes. Elias continued his routine, allowing Ethan to observe without interference. He knew that trust couldn't be forced, it had to be earned, slowly and patiently. He found himself taking more care in his actions, aware of the boy's constant observation. He even started whistling softly as he worked, a habit he had long forgotten. One afternoon, as Elias was tending to the small vegetable patch he kept behind the cabin, Ethan approached him hesitantly. Can I help?" he asked, his voice still soft but a little stronger than before. Elias looked at the boy, his small frame and hesitant demeanor. It wouldn't be much help, but the offer itself was significant. "Sure, Ethan," he said, handing him a small trowel. "You can help me weed these carrots." Ethan knelt beside him, his brow furrowed in concentration as he carefully pulled the weeds. His small hands were clumsy at first, but he persevered, a quiet determination in his movements. As they worked side by side in the warm afternoon sun, a fragile sense of normalcy settled between them. The silence was no longer charged with tension, but filled with the quiet rhythm of their shared task. In the evenings, Elias would read aloud from the few books he owned, tales of adventure and the natural world. Ethan would listen intently, his eyes wide with wonder, the horrors of his past seeming to recede into the background for a while. Elias also started teaching Ethan simple tasks around the ranch: how to fetch water, how to feed the chickens, how to groom Betsy. The boy was eager to learn, his initial fear gradually being replaced by a quiet confidence. Despite these small steps forward, Elias knew that Ethan was still carrying a heavy burden of fear and trauma. He would often wake up in the night, hearing the boy's muffled cries from his makeshift bed by the fire. When he checked on him, Ethan would be asleep, his small face etched with distress. Elias knew that he couldn't erase the boy's past, but he could offer him a safe haven, a place where he could begin to heal. He also knew that by taking Ethan in, he had opened himself up to the possibility of further pain. The boy's past was a mystery, and that mystery could hold dangers that Elias couldn't even imagine. But looking at Ethan's slowly emerging smile, at the flicker of trust in his eyes, Elias knew he had made the right decision. He was no longer just a solitary rancher. He was something more, something akin to a guardian, and he would protect this boy with everything he had. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of life at the lonely ranch settled into a more predictable pattern. Ethan grew stronger and healthier. The bruises faded, and the raw gash on his cheek healed, leaving a thin white scar, a permanent reminder of his ordeal. He became more talkative, his initial whispers giving way to hesitant questions, and then to more confident pronouncements about the world around him. He peppered Elias with inquiries about the animals, the plants, the stars in the night sky. Elias, initially a man of few words, found himself patiently answering each one, rediscovering a childlike wonder in the world through Ethan's eyes. Ethan proved to be a quick learner, eager to help with the chores. He became adept at fetching water, feeding the chickens, and even helping Elias with minor repairs around the ranch. He developed a particular fondness for Betsy, spending hours grooming her and whispering secrets into her ear. Their days were filled with the simple tasks of ranch life, tending to the small herd of cattle, maintaining the fences, and working in the vegetable patch. In the evenings after supper, Elias would continue to read aloud, their small cabin filled with the adventures of faraway lands and the wonders of the natural world. As Ethan's trust in Elias deepened, he began to reveal small fragments of his past, hesitant glimpses into the life he had lived before. He spoke of a large, bustling town, of crowded streets and loud noises, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of the ranch. He mentioned a woman, his mother, her face a hazy memory, tinged with sadness. He never spoke of his father or the circumstances that led to his abandonment, and Elias never pressed him, knowing that those wounds were still too raw. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat by the crackling fire, Ethan looked up at Elias, his eyes serious. "Why did you help me?" he asked softly. "You didn't know me." Elias looked into the boy's earnest face, searching for the right words. "I couldn't just leave you there, Ethan," he said finally. "You were hurt and alone. It wasn't right." Ethan nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with the simple answer. But Elias knew there was more to it than that. Something in the boy's vulnerability had resonated with his own past pain, a loneliness that he recognized and couldn't ignore. As the seasons changed, so did their relationship. The initial wariness had been replaced by a quiet affection, a bond forged in shared hardship and unspoken understanding. Elias found himself looking forward to Ethan's chatter, his laughter, the small, everyday moments that had once been absent from his solitary life. He taught Ethan how to ride Betsy, starting with short, gentle rides around the ranch. The boy's initial fear quickly gave way to exhilaration as he learned to control the mare, his face alight with joy. Watching him, Elias felt a warmth spread through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since before the war, before the losses that had driven him into isolation. One day, as they were returning from a longer ride, they came across a small, abandoned cabin nestled in a grove of trees. It was dilapidated and overgrown, but the sturdy stone foundation hinted at a more prosperous past. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his curiosity piqued. "Just an old homestead," Elias replied, but something about the place caught his attention. It was further from his own ranch, more secluded, and offered a bit more space. The thought flickered through his mind. Maybe it was time to build something more permanent for them, a real home. The idea stayed with him, growing stronger in the following weeks. He started to clear the land around the old cabin, his calloused hands working with a renewed sense of purpose. Ethan, eager to help, followed him with smaller tools, clearing brush and gathering stones. Building a home was a daunting task, but for the first time in years, Elias felt a sense of hope, a belief in a future that included someone else. He wasn't just building a shelter, he was building a foundation for a new life. A life where he wasn't alone, where he had someone to care for and someone who cared for him. The silence of the ranch was now often broken by the sound of their voices, by the rhythmic swing of Elias's axe and Ethan's cheerful chatter. The loneliness that had been his constant companion was slowly fading, replaced by the quiet comfort of companionship. Their peaceful existence was shattered by the unexpected arrival of a stranger. A lone rider appeared on the horizon one sweltering afternoon, a figure silhouetted against the shimmering heat. As he drew closer, Elias felt a prickle of unease. Strangers rarely ventured this far out, and those who did usually had a reason. The rider was a tall, lean man with a hard, weathered face and cold, assessing eyes. He was dressed in dusty buckskins and carried a rifle across his saddle. He reined his horse to a halt a short distance from Elias, who stood watching him, his own hand instinctively resting near the pistol tucked into his waistband. Ethan stood behind Elias, peeking out nervously. "Howdy," the stranger said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "Name's Cole. Just passing through looking for water." Elias nodded curtly. "There's a creek about a mile west. You're welcome to fill your canteen." Cole's gaze flickered towards Ethan, lingering for a moment before returning to Elias. "That your boy?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "He stays here," Elias replied, his voice firm, offering no further explanation. Cole's lips curled into a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looks familiar. A cold knot of dread tightened in Elias's stomach. He didn't like the way Cole was looking at Ethan, the possessive glint in his eyes. "Maybe you've seen him around," Elias said, trying to keep his voice even. "He's been with me for a while." "A while, huh?" Cole repeated, his gaze still fixed on Ethan. "Where'd you find him?" Elias hesitated. He didn't owe this man any explanations, but he knew that arousing suspicion could be dangerous. "Found him, lost," he said finally, "out on the trail." Cole dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He tied his horse to the fence post and walked a few steps closer, his eyes never leaving Ethan. The boy instinctively moved further behind Elias, his small hand clutching the back of the rancher's shirt. "Lost, you say?" Cole repeated, a hint of mockery in his voice. "He doesn't look lost to me. Looks more like he's found himself a new keeper." Elias tensed, his hand tightening on his pistol grip beneath his shirt. "He's under my protection," he said, his voice low and warning. Cole chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Protection? From what? Or maybe... from who?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Elias knew he had to tread carefully. He didn't know who this Cole was or what his connection to Ethan might be, but he sensed danger. "Look, mister," Elias said, trying to defuse the situation. "You want water? Get your water and move on. We're just trying to live in peace here." "Peace?" Cole scoffed. "There ain't no peace in this territory, old man. Not for runaways, and not for those who harbor them." His words sent a shiver down Elias's spine. How did Cole know? Had Ethan said something, or was it just a lucky guess? "The boy hasn't run from anything," Elias lied, his gaze unwavering. "He's an orphan. I took him in." Cole took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Orphan, huh? Funny, he doesn't look like any orphan I've ever seen. He looks like a boy who belongs to someone else." He reached out suddenly, his hand darting towards Ethan. Elias reacted instantly, stepping in front of the boy, his body a shield. "Don't touch him," Elias growled, his eyes locked on Cole's. Cole froze, his hand hovering in the air. He stared at Elias, his expression hardening. "You're making a mistake, old man," he said, his voice now laced with menace. "That boy, he's trouble. And anyone who gets in the way of what's mine, well, they'll find trouble too." He let his hand drop, but his gaze remained fixed on Ethan, a predatory look in his eyes. "I'll be seeing you around," he said, his voice a promise. He turned and walked back to his horse, mounted, and without another word, rode away in the direction of the creek. Elias watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. The encounter had been brief but chilling. He had no doubt that Cole would be back. The man's words and demeanor had been too menacing to ignore. He turned to Ethan, who was trembling behind him, his eyes wide with fear. Elias knelt down and put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, son," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "He's gone now." But he knew that the peace they had found on the lonely ranch had been shattered. The outside world, the world Ethan had come from, had found them, and the danger was far from over. He had taken in a lost boy, hoping to give him a better life, but in doing so, he had perhaps brought a new kind of trouble to their doorstep, a trouble that could threaten everything they had built together. The silence of the ranch now felt heavy with foreboding, the vast empty landscape no longer a sanctuary, but a stage for an unknown threat. The unsettling visit from the man named Cole cast a long, oppressive shadow over the ranch. The air, once clear and crisp with the scent of pine and dry earth, now seemed thick with an invisible menace. Elias went about his chores with a new, heightened sense of vigilance, every movement deliberate, every glance a scan of the horizon. His rifle, once a tool for hunting and protection against the rare wild animal, was now a constant presence, a cold weight by his side, a grim reminder of the world he had tried to leave behind. He taught Ethan to recognize the subtle signs of an approaching rider, the telltale dust cloud on the horizon, the faint drumming of hooves carried on the wind, how to duck behind cover with practiced, silent urgency, and, most importantly, how to stay absolutely still and silent when danger was near. The peaceful rhythm they had established was broken, replaced by a constant low-level anxiety that hummed just beneath the surface of their quiet lives. Ethan, too, seemed to revert to his earlier, more fearful self. The open, trusting expression he had begun to wear was replaced by a withdrawn, guarded look. He became quiet, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a small, vigilant sentinel. The trust that had blossomed between them now felt fragile, tested by this new and unseen threat. Elias knew he couldn't ignore the danger. Cole's words, his predatory gaze, and his sudden, uninvited appearance meant he was not just a drifter passing through. He was a hunter, and Ethan was his prey. The question that gnawed at Elias was, why? What could a small boy, alone in the wilderness, possibly possess that would bring such men to his doorstep? That evening, as they sat by the fire, its light a warm, flickering beacon against the encroaching darkness, Elias decided to finally ask the question he had been avoiding. "Ethan," he began, his voice low and gentle, a soft, soothing murmur. "That man, Cole, do you know him?" Ethan flinched, his small body tensing, his shoulders hunching as if to protect himself from an unseen blow. He shook his head, not meeting Elias's eyes, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "No, I don't know him." Elias watched the boy's hands, which were clenched so tightly into fists the knuckles were white. He saw the tremor that ran through his small frame. "Are you sure, son? He seemed to know you." A long, suffocating silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the low, mournful sigh of the wind. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, a small, fragile sound in the vast open space, Ethan spoke. He was with my father." The words were a hammer blow. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a heavy, suffocating weight. "Your father?" he asked, his voice strained, a rough, gravelly sound. "Tell me about your father, Ethan." The dam of silence broke. Ethan began to speak, the words tumbling out in a rush, a torrent of long-held fear and pain, as if they had been waiting to escape for months. He spoke of a man he called Papa, a man who was often absent, who drank too much and who had a mean streak that could turn on a dime. He spoke of a life on the move, from one ramshackle town to the next, never staying in one place for long, always on the run from something or someone. He had a lot of men with him sometimes," Ethan stammered, his eyes filling with tears. "Like Cole. They were always talking about the Hall. And they were always angry, always." Elias listened, his heart aching for the boy, a raw, exposed wound. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Ethan wasn't just an abandoned child. He was a runaway, a witness to something sinister, a small, innocent pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game. "What was the Hall, Ethan?" Elias asked, his voice soft, a gentle, probing question. Ethan shook his head, tears now streaming down his face, a silent, painful river. "I don't know. I just remember the fight. They were shouting, and Papa he was hitting Mama. She was trying to get me to run, to just go, and then he turned on her, and I ran." Elias felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it took his breath away, a white-hot fury that made his hands tremble. He reached out and pulled the boy into a tight embrace. Ethan, after a moment of surprise, buried his face in Elias's chest and wept, the small, shaky sobs a testament to the fear he had endured. "It's okay, son," Elias murmured, stroking the boy's back, a slow, gentle motion. "It's okay, you're safe now, you're with me." He held him for a long time, the weight of the boy's pain a heavy burden on his own soul. He now understood the depth of Ethan's fear, the reason for the flinching and the distrust. The boy had been running from a life of violence and cruelty, a life that was now threatening to find him again, a life that had finally found a face and a name. When Ethan's sobs subsided, he pulled away, wiping his face on the sleeve of his worn shirt. He's going to find me, isn't he?" he whispered, his eyes wide with a familiar terror, a deep, bone-deep fear. Elias looked at the boy, his own past as a soldier coming back to him. He knew what it felt like to be hunted. He also knew what it felt like to protect someone, to stand between a vulnerable life and a deadly threat. "No," Elias said, his voice firm and unwavering. "He's not going to find you. I won't let him." The words were a promise, not just to Ethan, but to himself. He had spent years running from his own demons, but now, faced with a real, tangible threat, he felt a new resolve. He would fight for this boy, for the fragile life they were building together, no matter the cost. The next morning, the air was thick with a new, unspoken understanding. Ethan's confession had changed everything. He was no longer just a lost boy. He was a boy with a past that was now actively hunting him. The threat, once an abstract idea, was now a solid, terrifying reality. Elias began to prepare for the inevitable. He checked his supplies, his movements methodical and precise. He cleaned his firearms, the cold, hard steel a familiar weight in his hands, and spent long hours on the high ridge overlooking the ranch, his rifle resting on his lap as he scanned the horizon, his eyes a constant, vigilant presence on the world. He also began teaching Ethan more practical survival skills, showing him how to track animals, how to find water in the dry canyons, and how to stay hidden in the unforgiving landscape. Ethan, for his part, absorbed every lesson with a quiet determination. The fear was still there, a constant shadow in his eyes, but it was now tempered by a growing sense of purpose. He was no longer just running. He was learning to fight back, to survive, to be more than a victim. One afternoon, as they were working on the old homestead, Elias pointed out some tracks in the dust. "See those, Ethan?" he asked. "That's a lone rider. The horse is a big one, probably a man, not a woman." Ethan knelt, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Like Cole's horse?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, a small, fragile sound that carried a weight of its own. Elias nodded grimly. "Could be. That's why you always have to be watching, son. Always." Ethan seemed to understand the gravity of the lesson. He began to pay more attention to the subtle signs of the trail, the way the grass was bent, the broken twigs, the faint scuff marks on the rocks. He was a natural observer, a trait born of a life lived on the run, a life that had taught him to notice the things other people ignored. Their days became a delicate balance of normal ranch life and a constant state of readiness. They would spend the mornings mending fences and tending to the cattle, the afternoons practicing their survival skills, and the evenings huddled by the fire, the silence between them now filled with the weight of shared secrets and unspoken fears, a bond forged in the crucible of their shared experience. The bond between them deepened with every passing day. Elias found himself sharing stories of his own past, of his time in the war, of the men he had known and the things he had seen. He spoke not to frighten Ethan, but to show him that he too had known loss and fear, and had found a way to survive, to show him that they were not so different after all. One evening, as the moon rose over the stark landscape, a brilliant, silvery orb against the black canvas of the sky, Ethan looked at Elias, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. Are you going to send me away?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain, a fragile, hopeful question. Elias looked at the boy, his heart a raw, exposed wound. The thought had crossed his mind. He was an old man, and this was a young boy with a dangerous past. Maybe a life with him constantly on the run was not what was best for Ethan. But as he looked at the trust in the boy's eyes, at the small, confident smile he was starting to see, he knew he couldn't do it. He had made a promise, and he would keep it. "No, Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not sending you away. We're in this together. We'll face whatever comes, you and I." The words seemed to settle something in Ethan. He gave a small, shaky smile, and then, in a gesture that was both familiar and new, he rested his hand on Elias's arm. Elias, in turn, placed his own hand over the boy's. It was a silent promise, a pact forged in the firelight. They were no longer just a lonely rancher and a lost boy. They were a family, and they would protect their home and each other, no matter the cost. The winter descended upon the high plains with a quiet ferocity. The wind howled through the canyons, a constant, mournful wail, and the snow fell in thick, silent blankets, covering the landscape in a stark, beautiful white. The ranch became a fortress of isolation, cut off from the rest of the world. For Elias, the isolation was a comfort. It meant they were safe, for now. The mountains and the plains were an impassable barrier, a silent, unmoving promise of a temporary peace. But the cold also brought its own set of challenges. The cattle needed extra feed, the fences needed constant mending against the weight of the snow, and the cabin, despite Elias's best efforts, was a drafty, cold place, a constant battle against the frigid air that seeped through the cracks. Elias and Ethan worked together, their movements synchronized by months of shared routine. They would bundle up in thick coats, their breath fogging in the frigid air, as they went about their chores. Ethan, now stronger and more resilient, was an invaluable help. He was small enough to squeeze into tight spaces to fix broken boards, and his small hands were more nimble than Elias's calloused ones. In the evenings, they would huddle by the fire, the small cabin a warm island in the vast sea of cold. Elias would continue to read, their voices weaving into the quiet hum of the wind outside. Sometimes Ethan would draw in the dust on the floor, his small fingers creating intricate pictures of horses and birds and mountains. Elias would watch him, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. The threat from Cole and his men seemed to have receded with the arrival of the snow. The trails were impassable, and Elias knew that anyone foolish enough to try and cross the mountains would not make it. But he also knew that the threat was not gone, only dormant. They were waiting for spring, for the thaw, for the moment when the trails would once again be open. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, a furious, white-hot maelstrom, Elias was jolted awake by a muffled sound. He reached for his rifle, his senses on high alert. It was a sob, a small choked sound coming from Ethan's bed, a sound of profound, heart-wrenching pain. Elias slid out of his bunk and went to the boy. Ethan was huddled in his blankets, his body shaking with silent sobs. "Ethan," Elias whispered, his hand resting gently on the boy's back. "What is it, son? Bad dream?" Ethan shook his head, burying his face in his hands. I keep seeing her," he choked out. "My mama. She was so scared, and I ran. I just left her." Elias felt a pang of profound sadness. The boy was carrying a heavy burden of guilt, a feeling of responsibility for a situation he had no control over. "Ethan," Elias said, his voice firm but kind. He pulled the boy into his arms. "Listen to me, you were a little boy. You did what she told you to do, you ran, you did what she wanted, you saved yourself. But she needed me," Ethan sobbed. "She needed you to be safe, son," Elias said, holding him close. "That's all she wanted, and you are. She would be proud of you, she would be proud that you're strong and that you're here." Elias held the boy for a long time, the words of comfort a balm for his own old wounds. He had felt that same guilt, that same sense of helplessness in the aftermath of the war. He had seen men die, men he should have saved. He knew what it was like to carry that weight. As Ethan's sobs subsided, Elias continued to hold him, whispering words of comfort and reassurance. The boy eventually fell back to sleep, his breathing even and calm. Elias remained awake for a long time, the fire crackling and the wind howling outside. He knew that their journey of healing was far from over. The physical scars were gone, but the emotional ones remained. And he knew that the moment the snow melted, the real challenge would begin. Spring arrived with a sudden burst of life, a vibrant explosion of green against the brown and grey of the winter-worn landscape. The snow melted, swelling the creek and turning the trails into muddy rivers. The air was filled with the scent of wet earth and budding life, a hopeful perfume after the long, cold winter. The return of the warmth also brought with it a renewed sense of unease. Elias spent more time on the ridge, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of a rider. The solitude of the ranch, once a sanctuary, now felt like a vulnerable outpost, a place where they were exposed to a world that was ready to hurt them. He continued to work on the old homestead, his movements now fueled by a sense of urgency. The cabin was taking shape, the walls going up, the roof a sturdy skeleton of wood. Ethan was a constant presence by his side, handing him tools, fetching water, and carrying stones. One day, as they were working, Ethan stopped suddenly, his head cocked to the side. "Did you hear that, Elias?" he asked, his voice low. Elias stopped what he was doing, his senses on high alert. He listened, his ears straining against the sound of the wind, and then he heard it too, the faint rhythmic drumming of hooves on the soft earth. "Get inside, Ethan," he commanded, his voice a low growl, "and stay quiet. Don't make a sound." Ethan didn't hesitate. He dropped the tool he was holding and darted for the cabin. Elias watched him go before grabbing his rifle and moving to a position behind a large boulder, his body concealed from view. He waited, the silence stretched to a breaking point. The sound of the hooves grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one rider, there were two. Two men rode into view, their figures looming against the blue sky, their forms a dark, menacing presence on the horizon. One was Cole, his cold, hard eyes scanning the ranch, a hungry, predatory gaze. The other was an older man, his face a web of wrinkles, his hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. There was a cruel, knowing smirk on his face, an arrogance that made Elias's blood run cold. Cole pointed to the unfinished homestead. "Looks like he's settling in, boss. Thought he'd have hightailed it by now." The older man, who Cole had called boss, chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound that was devoid of any humor. "He's a fool. Thinks he can hide what's mine. You check the other ranches." "Yep," Cole replied. "No sign of him. This has to be the place. He ain't got nowhere else to go." "Good," the boss said, his gaze fixed on the cabin, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "The boy?" "He's valuable. We have to be careful. Can't risk him getting hurt. He's our only leverage." Elias's heart pounded in his chest. Leverage for what? A ransom? A payoff? Whatever it was clear that Ethan was not just a lost boy. He was a valuable commodity, a pawn in a larger, more dangerous game. The men dismounted, their movements slow and deliberate, a show of their confidence, their boots crunching on the loose gravel. They began to walk towards the cabin, their hands resting near their firearms, a silent, menacing threat. "Elias," the boss called out, his voice echoing across the quiet landscape. "I know you're in there. You can't hide forever. Send the boy out, and we'll leave you be. We don't want any trouble. We just want what's ours." The cabin door remained closed, silent and unyielding. "Don't make me come in there, old man," the boss shouted, his voice now laced with frustration, a low, dangerous growl. "This ain't worth dying over." Elias remained silent, his rifle resting on the boulder, his finger on the trigger. He wasn't going to let them take Ethan, not without a fight. The two men exchanged a look. The boss gave a curt nod to Cole, who began to circle around the cabin, looking for a way in. The standoff was tense, the air thick with unspoken threats. Elias knew he was outgunned, and that he couldn't hold them off forever. He had to think of something, and fast. Just as Cole reached the side of the cabin, the door swung open and Ethan appeared in the doorway, a look of grim determination on his face. "Ethan, no!" Elias whispered, his heart in his throat, a cold, sharp pang of fear. Cole and the boss stopped in their tracks, their eyes fixed on the boy, their faces a mixture of surprise and triumph. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across the boss's face. "Well, look at that," he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "The little rascal comes out on his own. Smart boy. He knows which side his bread is buttered on." Ethan stood his ground, his small frame rigid. He looked directly at the boss, his eyes filled with a surprising mixture of fear and defiance, a quiet, unwavering strength. "I'm not going with you," he said, his voice small but firm. "I'm staying here. This is my home." The boss laughed, a booming, mirthless sound that echoed across the valley. "Your home? Son, you don't have a home. You're just a thing we lost, and now we're here to take you back." He began to walk towards the cabin, his hands open and his face a mask of feigned benevolence. But Elias saw the truth in his eyes. He was a wolf approaching a lamb, and Elias was the only one who could stand in his way. As the boss advanced on the cabin, his movements slow and deliberate, a show of his confidence, Elias made his move. He didn't want to draw blood if he didn't have to, but he would if he had to. "Stop right there!" Elias's voice, a low, powerful growl, echoed across the silent plains, a commanding, unwavering presence. The boss and Cole both froze, their eyes darting to Elias's position behind the boulder. Elias stepped out from his cover, his rifle aimed squarely at the boss's chest. "You're not taking him," he said, his voice unwavering. "He's with me now." The boss's face contorted in a mask of rage. "You're a fool, Thorn," he snarled, his eyes blazing with fury. "This ain't your fight. He's our blood, he's our property." "He's a child," Elias retorted, "and I'm not letting you take him back to whatever kind of life you came from." The boss took a slow, deliberate step forward, a menacing, silent threat. "Don't be stupid, old man. You and I both know you can't win this. I have friends. We can make your life a living hell. We can just take the boy and be done with it. Or we can burn this place to the ground and you with it." Elias's grip on his rifle tightened. He knew the man wasn't bluffing, but he also knew he couldn't back down. The stakes were too high, a life for a life, a choice he was more than ready to make. "Get on your horse, both of you," Elias said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "And don't come back." Cole, who had been silent up to this point, now spoke up. "We ain't leaving without the boy, not after all this trouble." Elias shifted his aim, pointing his rifle at Cole. "I'm not going to ask again." A tense moment of silence stretched between them, the air thick with unspoken threats. The boss and Cole exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, the boss gave a slow, reluctant nod. "All right, Thorn," the boss said, his voice a low hiss, filled with a simmering, barely contained rage. "You win. For now." He turned and began to walk back to his horse. Cole, his eyes fixed on Elias, followed him, his movements slow and menacing, a silent, unmoving threat. They mounted their horses, their gazes never leaving Elias. "This ain't over," Cole spat, his voice filled with venom. "Not by a long shot. You'll be seeing us again, and next time we won't be so polite." The men turned their horses and rode away, their figures once again disappearing into the vast landscape, swallowed by the horizon. Elias watched them go, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He didn't lower his rifle until their figures were no more than a speck on the horizon. He walked back to the cabin, his legs trembling with adrenaline. He found Ethan standing in the doorway, his small face pale and his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. Elias knelt, his large hands resting on the boy's shoulders. "Are you all right, son?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan nodded, his eyes welling up with tears. You weren't going to let them take me," he whispered. "Never," Elias said, pulling the boy into a fierce hug. "Never." He held him for a long time, their small embrace a testament to the fragile but unbreakable bond they had forged. The peace was shattered, and the threat was real. But in that moment, in the aftermath of their confrontation, Elias knew that he would do anything to protect this boy, this child who had, against all odds, become his family. They had survived this encounter, but the knowledge that they would be back, and that their next visit would be far from polite, was a heavy burden to bear. The quiet life they had built was now a battlefield, and they had just fired the first shot. The days following Cole and the boss's visit were filled with a grim, unsettling silence. Elias and Ethan worked with a new sense of purpose, their every action dictated by the knowledge that their time was running out. The unfinished homestead, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a desperate race against an unseen clock. Elias knew he had to fortify their position. He spent his days building a sturdy fence around the cabin and homestead, not just to keep the cattle in, but to create a defensible perimeter. He also dug a small trench near the main cabin, a shallow hideout that would provide cover if they were attacked. Ethan, a silent but tireless partner, carried the rocks and dirt, his small hands working with a fierce determination. The nights were the hardest. The wind, which had once felt like a gentle companion, now seemed to whisper warnings. Elias slept fitfully, his rifle by his side, his senses on high alert. He would often wake to find Ethan curled up in his bed, his small body trembling from a nightmare he refused to speak of. Elias would hold him, whispering reassurances into the darkness, but he knew that words were no longer enough. The fear was a living thing, a shadow that had taken root in their small home. One afternoon, as they were working on the fence, Ethan looked up at Elias, his eyes clouded with a familiar question. "They're coming back, aren't they?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elias paused, leaning on his shovel. He couldn't lie to the boy. "Yes, Ethan," he said, his voice grave. "They are." Ethan's small face crumpled. He was no longer the brave boy who had faced down a grown man in the doorway. He was just a child, and the weight of it all was too much. "I'm scared, Elias," he said, his voice breaking. Elias knelt, his gaze level with the boy's. "I know, son, I'm scared too, but we're going to be ready. We're going to fight, and we're going to win." He said the words with a conviction he hoped Ethan would believe. It was the only way to get through this. Elias took a deep breath. "Tell me everything, Ethan. Everything you remember about your father and those men. The town, the people, the words they used. Everything." The boy, after a moment's hesitation, began to speak again. He spoke of the town of Blackwater, a bustling, lawless place. He spoke of his father, a man named Silas, who ran a card game and had a reputation for violence. He spoke of the men who frequented his father's game, men with a shared sense of secrecy, always whispering about a big score, a haul that would set them up for life. He spoke of his mother, a quiet, gentle woman who was often bruised and often sad, who had tried to leave 100 times but was always pulled back. Ethan's small voice, filled with a raw honesty, painted a vivid picture of a world Elias had only glimpsed. A world of greed, of violence, of men who would do anything for a profit. And at the center of it all was Ethan. A boy who had seen and heard too much, who was now a key, a living link to something his father and his men wanted to keep hidden. Elias listened, his face grim, his mind racing. The more he learned, the more he understood the stakes. This wasn't just about a lost boy. It was about something far more valuable, something that had driven these men to hunt a child across the unforgiving landscape. Elias knew he was outmatched in every way. He was a simple rancher against a gang of criminals. But he also had something they didn't, a reason to fight, a reason to protect. When Ethan had finished, a heavy silence fell between them. The sun beat down on the dusty ground, the world a peaceful, beautiful lie. Elias put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice filled with a new resolve. "You've done good. Now let's get back to work. We have a home to finish." The work on the homestead became more than just a task. It became a symbol of their defiance, a testament to their will to survive. They would not be hunted. They would stand their ground, and they would face whatever came, together. The days bled into weeks, each one a tense waiting game. The sun beat down, the wind blew, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Elias and Ethan went about their routine, but the air was thick with unspoken anxiety. Elias, in a rare moment of introspection, found himself thinking about his own past. The war had taught him many things, but one lesson stood out above all others. You can't fight a battle you don't understand. And he didn't understand what these men were after. He knew Ethan was a witness, a key to something, but what was it? What was the haul that was so valuable, so dangerous, that they would hunt a child across a continent? He decided he had to know. He had to ride into town, into the very heart of the world Ethan had fled, and find out. He knew it was a risk, a fool's errand, but he also knew it was the only way to truly prepare for the coming fight. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Elias told Ethan his plan. "I'm going to Blackwater, son," he said, his voice calm. "I need to find out what those men are after." Ethan's eyes, wide with fear, looked up at him. "No, don't go, Elias. It's dangerous. They'll find you." "I'll be careful, Ethan," Elias said, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "I'll be quick. I just need to get a look to hear what people are saying." He could see the terror in the boy's eyes, the memory of a place filled with violence and fear. But he also saw a growing trust, a belief that Elias could and would return. "I won't be long," Elias promised. "I'll be back before you know it. And while I'm gone, you stay inside. Don't go out. Don't talk to anyone. Understand?" Ethan nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path down his dusty cheek. "Be safe, Elias," he whispered. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Elias saddled Betsy and rode out. He left Ethan with enough food and water for a few days, a loaded rifle, and a final fierce hug. As he rode away, he looked back at the small, sturdy figure standing in the doorway of the cabin, a silent promise hanging in the air between them. The ride was long and filled with a constant sense of unease. He avoided the main trails, sticking to the ridges and the dry riverbeds, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He was a hunter now, but he was also the hunted. He arrived in Blackwater at dusk. The town was a bustling, chaotic mess of saloons, stores, and dusty, unpaved streets. The air was thick with the smell of whiskey, sawdust, and horses. Elias dismounted and tied Betsy to the hitching post outside the general store, his senses on high alert. He walked through the streets, his eyes and ears taking it all in. He heard whispers, hushed conversations in the saloons and on the street corners. He heard the names Silas and Cole and a new name, the Dutchman. He heard talk of a train robbery, a botched job, and a fortune in gold that had gone missing. The pieces began to fall into place. Ethan's father, Silas, and his men were a gang of outlaws. They had robbed a train, a job that had gone wrong, and the gold had been lost. Ethan, it seemed, was the only one who knew where it was. Elias walked into a saloon, his eyes adjusting to the dim, smoky light. He ordered a whiskey, his gaze sweeping the room. He saw men like Cole, men with hard faces and cruel eyes. He saw men who looked like they were looking for something, or someone. As he was about to leave, he heard a man at the bar, a drunken, loud-mouthed fool speaking to his companion. "Did you hear?" the man slurred. "Silas and the Dutchman are back. They're looking for that boy, the one who ran off with the loot. They're offering a hefty reward for him, dead or alive, they say." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. The haul wasn't just missing, it was gone. And the men who were after it believed that Ethan had taken it. The boy was not just a witness, he was a thief in their eyes, and a valuable one at that. Elias knew he had to get out of there. He had what he needed. He had to get back to Ethan. He left the saloon, his mind racing, his senses on high alert. He mounted Betsy and rode out of town, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a protector, and he was riding into a war he never wanted to fight. The ride back to the ranch was a long, anxious blur. Elias pushed Betsy as hard as he dared, the information he had gathered burning a hole in his mind. Ethan was not just a witness. He was a target, a valuable one. His father, Silas, and his ruthless partner, the Dutchman, were convinced that the boy had run off with their stolen gold. Elias knew the truth. Ethan had not taken anything. He had run from a life of violence and abuse, a life that had now found a new, more dangerous reason to hunt him. The stakes had been raised. This wasn't just about a gang of outlaws. It was about a fortune, a missing treasure that could drive men to do the unthinkable. As he neared the ranch, a sense of dread settled in his stomach. He saw no smoke from the chimney, no movement near the cabin. He reined Betsy to a halt, his hand resting on his rifle, and approached with a cautious silence he had learned in the war. He dismounted and walked to the cabin, his heart pounding against his ribs. The door was ajar. He pushed it open, his rifle raised. The cabin was empty. The blankets were folded neatly, the meager supplies still there, but Ethan was gone. A cold, gut-wrenching despair washed over Elias. He had been so careful, so certain that he was doing the right thing. And yet he had failed. He had left the boy alone, and now he was gone. He felt a rage so pure and so cold, it made his hands tremble. He had left Ethan and they had taken him. He had known the risks and he had taken them anyway, and now he was paying the price. He sank to his knees, the weight of his failure a heavy, suffocating burden. He had promised Ethan that he would protect him, that he would never let them take him, and he had broken that promise. But as he looked around the cabin, a flicker of something caught his eye. A small, crumpled piece of paper lay on the floor near the fireplace. He picked it up, his hands shaking. It was a rough drawing of a horse, a small, crude picture drawn with a piece of charcoal. And on the back, in a shaky, childlike hand, were 3 words: "I went hiding." A surge of relief so profound it made him weak in the knees washed over him. Ethan was not taken. He had hidden. He had listened to Elias's words and had taken precautions. The boy was smarter, more resilient than Elias had given him credit for. He stood up, a new sense of purpose driving out the despair. He had to find him. He had to find Ethan before they did. He knew the boy was smart, but he was also a child, and the desert was an unforgiving place. Elias walked outside, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. He looked for a sign, a clue, anything that would tell him where Ethan had gone. And then he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible line of small footprints leading away from the cabin, towards the old homestead they had been working on. Elias followed the trail, his heart pounding with a renewed sense of hope. He found the boy crouched in the small hideout they had dug, his body trembling, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "Ethan," Elias said, his voice a low, soothing murmur. "It's me. I'm back." Ethan scrambled out of the trench, his small body launching itself into Elias's arms. He buried his face in the rancher's chest and wept, the small, shaky sobs a testament to the fear he had endured. Elias held him, stroking his back, whispering reassurances. "Oh, you did good, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did so good." When the sobs subsided, Ethan looked up at him, his eyes still red and swollen. "I heard them, Elias," he whispered. "I heard them talking. They were looking for me. They said I took the gold." Elias nodded grimly. "I know, son. I heard the same thing in Blackwater. They think you have it." "But I don't," Ethan said, his voice laced with indignation. "I didn't take anything." "I know," Elias said, his voice firm. "I know you didn't, but they don't. And they won't stop until they find you." He looked at the boy, his small, brave figure standing in the middle of a vast, unforgiving landscape. He knew what he had to do. They couldn't stay here. The ranch was no longer a safe haven, it was a trap. They had to leave, to find a new place to hide, a new life to build. And this time, Elias would not make the same mistake. He would not leave the boy. He would not let him out of his sight. The war had begun and they were on the run. The decision to leave the ranch was a hard one. It was the only home Elias had known for years, a place where he had built a life, however solitary. But he knew, with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as a winter wind, that it was no longer a safe place for them. The boss and Cole knew where they were. It was only a matter of time before they returned, and this time they would not be so polite. They packed what they could onto Betsy and a second pack horse, food, water, blankets, and a few essential tools. Elias took the time to bury his small store of money and the few keepsakes he owned, a somber farewell to a life that was now irrevocably gone. As he looked at the small, sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands, a pang of sadness and regret settled in his chest. But one look at Ethan's small, pale face was all he needed to reaffirm his decision. "Where are we going, Elias?" Ethan asked, his voice small and uncertain as they rode away from the ranch. Elias looked at the boy, his own mind a whirlwind of possibilities. He couldn't go back to Blackwater. That was a trap. He couldn't go east, where the cities were. That was too crowded, too easy for them to track. He had to go into the unknown, into the vast, unforgiving wilderness that lay west. "West, son," Elias said, his voice calm. "To the mountains. We'll find a place there where they can't find us. A place where we can start again." The journey was long and arduous. They rode for days, the sun a constant, unforgiving presence in the sky, the nights a cold, silent void. Ethan was a trooper, his small body a testament to his newfound resilience. He never complained, his small hands holding tight to the saddle, his eyes scanning the horizon with a newfound vigilance. Elias was a master of the land, a tracker and a survivalist. He taught Ethan how to recognize edible plants, how to find water in the dry canyons, and how to build a fire with a single match. They were no longer a rancher and a boy. They were a team, a small, fragile unit on the run. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire eating their meager supper, Ethan looked up at Elias, his eyes serious. "Why are they so mad about the gold, Elias?" he asked. "Couldn't they just get more?" Elias sighed. "It's not just about the gold, son. It's about pride. It's about a job that went wrong. It's about a lost fortune that they can't get back, and they believe you're the one who has it. To them, you're not just a boy. You're a symbol of their failure, and they want to fix that, no matter what it takes." Ethan seemed to understand. He had seen the way his father and his men looked at each other when things went wrong. He knew what it was like to be the scapegoat, the one who bore the brunt of their anger. As they rode deeper into the mountains, the landscape changed. The dusty, barren plains gave way to lush forests, towering peaks, and crystal-clear streams. It was a beautiful, majestic world, a world that offered a kind of peace that Elias had forgotten existed. One afternoon, as they were riding through a dense forest, Elias spotted something ahead, a small, winding trail that led to a secluded valley. He reined Betsy to a halt. "What is it?" Ethan asked. "A place to rest," Elias said, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. They followed the trail, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth. The valley opened up before them, a hidden gem nestled between two towering peaks. A small stream, fed by a waterfall, ran through the center, and a small abandoned miner's shack sat on the bank. It was dilapidated and overgrown, but it was a shelter, a place to stop running. "We can stay here, Elias?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with a hopeful reverence. "We can stay here, son," Elias said, a small smile gracing his lips. "For now." They dismounted, their bodies weary from the long journey. As Elias began to unload their supplies, he looked at Ethan, who was standing by the stream, his small face filled with a childlike wonder. They were on the run, their lives in danger, but in that moment, in the quiet solitude of the valley, they were also at peace. They had found a temporary home, a small fragile sanctuary in the heart of an unforgiving world, but Elias knew with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as a winter wind that their peace would not last. The men who were hunting them were relentless, and they would not stop until they had found their lost treasure and their lost boy. Life in the hidden valley settled into a new, quieter rhythm. The days were filled with the simple, satisfying work of survival. Elias and Ethan spent their mornings fishing in the stream, their afternoons gathering berries and wild vegetables, and their evenings huddled by the fire in the small miner's shack. The shack itself was in a state of disrepair, but Elias, with his years of experience, was able to make it into a comfortable if temporary home. He patched the roof, mended the walls, and built a small, sturdy table and chairs from the fallen trees. Ethan, his small hands now calloused and strong, was an invaluable helper. He was no longer just a boy who had run away. He was a survivor, a partner in their small two-person world. The bond between them deepened, forged by shared hardship and a constant, unspoken sense of purpose. They were a family, a small, fragile unit against a vast and dangerous world. They spoke little of the past, their conversations revolving around the present, around the simple things of life, the catch of the day, the weather, the beauty of the mountains that surrounded them. One afternoon, as they were fishing, a new question, a difficult one, arose. "Elias," Ethan said, his voice hesitant, What happens when the money runs out?" Elias reeled in his line, his eyes on the water. It was a question he had been avoiding. They had enough food for now, enough to last them through the season, but what then? They couldn't stay here forever. They would need supplies, a way to make a living, a way to build a real life. "I don't know, son," Elias said, his voice low. "We'll figure it out when the time comes." But Ethan, his eyes filled with a childlike clarity, was not so easily placated. "They think I have the gold," he said. What if I find it and give it to them?" Elias reeled. He had never even considered the possibility that the boy had the gold. It was a ludicrous idea, a desperate child running with a heavy fortune. But as he looked at the boy, he saw the seriousness in his eyes, the simple, logical solution that only a child could come up with. "No, Ethan," Elias said, his voice firm, "you don't have it, and even if you did, you wouldn't give it to them. They're dangerous men. They'd just take it, and they'd still hurt you." "But what if I do have it?" Ethan insisted. "What if I took it, and I just don't remember?" Elias looked at the boy, his heart aching. He saw the doubt, the fear, the terrible burden the boy was carrying. He had run from a world he didn't understand, and now he was living in a world that was a direct result of that past. He was a pawn in a game he didn't know the rules of, and he was convinced that he was the problem. "You don't have it, son," Elias repeated, his voice gentle but firm. "They're just trying to scare you, to make you believe something that isn't true." Ethan didn't look convinced. He was still holding on to the idea that he was a lost piece of a puzzle, a key to a fortune. He was so used to being a problem, so used to being the reason for his father's anger and his mother's sadness, that he couldn't help but believe that this was his fault too. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Elias told Ethan a story about a soldier who had lost his way, a soldier who had run from his past, from the ghosts of a war he couldn't win. He spoke of the guilt, of the shame, of the feeling that he was a problem that had to be solved, and he spoke of a small, lost boy who had found him and who had shown him that he was not a problem, but a person. He saw the understanding dawn in Ethan's eyes, the recognition of a shared experience. They were both running from a past they couldn't control, from a guilt they didn't deserve. "You didn't do anything wrong, Ethan," Elias said, his voice filled with a profound sense of love and compassion. "You just survived, and that's all anyone can ask of you." He saw the tears well up in the boy's eyes, the quiet, silent sobs that shook his small frame. Elias reached out and pulled the boy into his arms. He held him as he wept, the past washing away in a torrent of shared sadness and understanding. They were a family. They were running from a dark past, and they were fighting for a future they didn't know. And as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, they were not alone. They were together. And in that moment, that was enough. The peace of the hidden valley was a fragile thing, built on the illusion of isolation. Elias, a man whose life had been a constant study of the land, felt the first crack in that illusion on a cold morning. The wind, which usually carried the clean scent of pine and water, brought with it a foreign metallic tang, the faint acrid smell of old whiskey and wood smoke that clung to men who had lived hard and had little to lose. A chill, more profound than the mountain air, settled in his bones. He knew this scent. It was the smell of a past he had tried to outrun, and it had finally caught up. Without a word, a silent, grim understanding passing between them, Elias led Ethan to a vantage point atop a rocky ridge. From there, they had a sweeping, panoramic view of the valley's narrow entrance. Elias raised the old, brass-framed field glasses he'd retrieved from the shack. The lenses, dusty and worn, brought the world into sharp, unforgiving focus. Sure enough, two figures on horseback emerged from the canyon below. They rode slowly, their heads turning from side to side like hunting dogs on a scent, their forms small dark specks against the vastness of the landscape. It was Cole and the boss. Elias's heart pounded, a cold, hard knot in his stomach. They had not only found them, they had followed them for hundreds of miles, a testament to their relentless pursuit and the terrifying value they placed on whatever they believed Ethan had. "We need to get to the high country," Elias whispered, his voice low and urgent, a stark contrast to the vast silence of the mountains. "We need to get to the peaks, where they can't follow on horseback. We have to leave everything behind." Ethan nodded, his small face a mask of grim determination. The fear was still there, a ghost in his eyes, but it was now tempered by a cold resolve that Elias had never seen before. He was no longer a runaway child. He was a survivor preparing for a final stand. He had seen the world at its most brutal, and now he was ready to face it head-on. They packed only what they could carry on foot, a brutal, minimalist inventory. Elias's rifle and a handful of rounds, a small pack of jerky and dried fruit, a canteen of water, and a single, well-worn blanket. They left everything else behind, the small miner's shack, the unfinished homestead, the life they had built in the valley. It was now just a memory, another piece of their past left in the dust. They moved with a desperate, synchronized urgency, their movements a silent, frantic dance of a shared purpose. Elias, with his long, sure strides, led the way, his eyes and ears on constant alert. Ethan, with his small, sure feet, followed close behind, his gaze fixed on the ground, on the trail they were leaving, on the silent promise that they would leave no trace, no breadcrumbs for the wolves behind them. They climbed higher and higher, the air growing thinner and colder with every step, a brutal, unforgiving test of their endurance. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged rock faces and sheer, treacherous cliffs. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, and Elias found himself lifting Ethan over boulders and pulling him up rock faces. The boy never complained, his small hands holding tight to Elias's, his trust in the old rancher a palpable, unbreakable thing. As they reached a high-altitude plateau, a cold, biting wind began to whip at them, a final warning from the mountain itself. They huddled behind a large boulder, their bodies shaking from the cold and exhaustion, their breath misting in the frigid air. Elias looked back, down into the valley below. He saw the two figures dismount from their horses, their forms now small, insignificant specks against the vastness of the landscape. They were on foot, but they were still coming. They were relentless. "They're going to climb after us," Ethan whispered, his voice a ghost on the wind, a small, fragile sound in the vast open space. Elias nodded grimly. "They are. But they don't know this mountain. They don't know where to look. We do." They spent the night in a small, cramped cave, huddled together for warmth, the cold seeping into their bones. Elias lit a small, smokeless fire, a tiny flickering light in the vast, silent darkness. Ethan, huddled close, looked up at Elias, his eyes wide with an unspoken question, a question that hung in the air between them, heavy with fear and uncertainty. "What happens now, Elias?" he whispered, his voice small, a fragile sound in the cold, unyielding silence. Elias looked at the boy, his heart aching. He had no easy answers, no simple solutions. He was a rancher, not a soldier. He was a protector, not a killer. But now it seemed he had to be both. "We fight," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, a promise that was as hard and unyielding as the rock they were standing on. "We fight for our lives. We fight for our home. We fight for a future where we don't have to run anymore." The words were a vow, a promise to a future that felt as uncertain and as dangerous as the jagged peaks that surrounded them. But as he looked at the trust in Ethan's eyes, a trust that was the only thing holding him together, Elias knew he would keep that promise, no matter the cost. The morning brought a cruel, biting wind and a sky the color of old bruises. Elias and Ethan continued their ascent, climbing higher and higher into the mountains, each step a testament to their desperate will to survive. The altitude made every breath a labor, a sharp burning pain in their lungs, and the cold gnawed at their bones, a constant, unrelenting ache. Elias, with his old, weary body, felt the strain of the climb, the familiar aches and pains of a life spent in physical labor, now compounded by a frantic, desperate fear. But he was driven by a force far stronger than physical pain, the fierce, unyielding need to protect the boy who had, against all odds, become his son. They spent the morning moving from peak to peak, their movements a silent, grim-faced retreat. They were a small, insignificant part of the vast, majestic landscape, but they were also the center of a brutal, unforgiving hunt. Elias constantly scanned the slopes below, his field glasses a constant presence in his hand. He saw the two men, small specks against the grey rock, following their trail with a relentless, terrifying determination, their pursuit a dark, unmoving shadow on the landscape. "They're gaining on us," Ethan whispered, his voice a strained, breathless thing, his small hands clutching the rifle with a fierce, trembling grip. "I know," Elias said, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew they couldn't outrun them forever. The mountain was a big place, but it was not endless. They had to find a way to stop them. A final stand. He saw a small, narrow pass ahead, a twisting, dangerous canyon that led to the highest peak. He knew it was their only chance. A single, narrow path, a natural bottleneck that would force their pursuers to come at them one at a time. It was a risk, a fool's gambit, but it was their only hope, the last-ditch effort of a desperate man. "This way," Elias said, his voice firm, a solid, unmoving presence in the face of their fear. "We're going to the pass. We're going to hold our ground." Ethan nodded, his eyes wide but determined. They moved into the canyon, the towering rock faces a silent, imposing presence on either side, their shadows long and dark. The air grew still, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the loose gravel. They reached a narrow ledge that overlooked the pass, a perfect ambush point, a natural fortress against the men who were hunting them. Elias handed Ethan his canteen and a handful of dried fruit. "You stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You stay hidden. And no matter what happens, you don't come out, understand?" Ethan nodded, his eyes fixed on Elias's, a small, scared but unwavering figure in the face of a terrifying uncertainty. "Be safe, Elias," he whispered, the words a small, desperate prayer. Elias smiled, a grim, weary expression that did not reach his eyes. "I will, son. I will." He took a position behind a large rock, his rifle resting on the ledge, his senses on high alert, his body a coiled spring of tension. He waited, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He heard them before he saw them, the faint sound of boots on rock, the labored breathing of men who had been climbing for hours, the low, frustrated mutters of a relentless pursuit. Cole emerged first, his face a mask of grim determination, his eyes scanning the path ahead, a hunter who had finally found his prey. He was followed closely by the boss, his face contorted in a mask of rage and impatience, his movements jerky and filled with a frustrated fury. "Where is he?" the boss snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that echoed through the canyon. "Where's the boy? I know he's here." Elias raised his rifle, the cold, hard steel a familiar weight in his hands. He wasn't a killer. He was a rancher, a man who had spent his life bringing things to life, not taking it. But he also knew what he had to do. "He's not here," Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble that echoed through the canyon, a defiant, unwavering presence. "He's gone. You're too late." Cole and the boss froze, their eyes darting to Elias's position, their faces a mixture of surprise and furious recognition. "Thorn!" the boss snarled, the name a curse on his lips. "I knew you were a fool. You should have given him to us. Now you're going to pay for it." He drew his pistol, a quick, practiced movement. Elias didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger, the rifle shot echoing through the canyon, a sharp, deafening blast that shattered the silence. The boss stumbled, a look of shock and disbelief on his face, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. He fell to his knees, his pistol clattering on the rock, his body a silent, defeated thing. Cole, his face a mask of fury, raised his own rifle and fired. The shot whizzing past Elias's head, kicking up a spray of rock and dust, a desperate, futile attempt at vengeance. Elias fired again, the bullet finding its mark, a clean, sharp shot that sent Cole stumbling backwards, his body a silent, still thing on the ground. The canyon was silent again, the echo of the rifle shots fading into the vast, empty space. Elias stood for a long time, his rifle still raised, his heart pounding in his chest. He was a killer now, a man who had taken a life. The weight of it was a heavy, suffocating burden, a dark stain on his soul. He slowly lowered his rifle, his hands shaking. He walked to the edge of the ledge and looked down. The two men lay still on the ground, their bodies a stark, silent testament to the brutal, unforgiving nature of the world they lived in. He heard a small, shaky sob from behind him. He turned and saw Ethan emerge from his hiding place, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe, his small face a mask of raw, unfiltered emotion. "Elias?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Are you okay?" Elias nodded, his throat tight with emotion, his eyes welling up with tears. He walked to the boy and knelt, his arms wrapping around him in a tight, fierce embrace. "It's over, son," he said, his voice thick with a profound, weary relief. "It's over." The boy clung to him, his small body shaking with silent sobs. Elias held him, his own eyes welling up with tears. He had done what he had to do, he had protected the boy, but he knew with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as the mountain wind that the scars of this day would be with them forever. The descent from the mountains was not a single act, but a long unraveling, step after heavy step, a slow surrender to gravity and fatigue. The trail that had once carried them upward in desperate flight now carried them down in silence. Every bend in the path, every outcropping of stone seemed to echo with the gunfire that had ended 2 lives. The mountains themselves stood tall and solemn, their jagged ridges painted in shadow, as though they too bore witness to what had transpired. Elias and Ethan did not speak. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, a weight so tangible it seemed to press upon their shoulders as heavily as the packs they carried. The boy walked just behind Elias, his steps sure but slower than before. He was not stumbling from fear now, but weighed down by thought. His silence was not that of terror, but of reflection. He had seen death, up close, violent, unflinching, and such a vision left no child untouched. Elias's own silence was different. His boots crunched against gravel, his rifle heavy against his back, and within his chest his heart carried a quiet thunder. He had protected the boy, yes, but in doing so he had crossed a line he had long hoped never to tread again. When they finally emerged from the high passes, the valley stretched below them, green and serene as if nothing had changed. The miner's shack sat weathered but waiting. The creek wound lazily through the meadow, and the half-built homestead stood like an unfinished promise. To anyone else, it would have looked like peace, but to them, returning felt like stepping into a place that would forever bear the shadows of what had been done. The valley welcomed them home, yes, but it also reminded them that the world would never be the same. The days that followed were filled with a strange quiet. Elias moved about the tasks of living, hauling water, mending tools, tending the animals, with steady hands, but his mind never rested. At night, when the fire burned low, he stared into the flames, his thoughts circling back again and again to the 2 men whose lives he had ended. He did not regret it, not exactly. They had been criminals, predators, men who would have destroyed a boy for nothing but greed. They had chosen their path, and Elias had simply been the final obstacle they could not cross. Yet knowing it was justified did not ease the burden. A part of him had been carved away in that canyon, and he knew it would not return. Ethan, too, was changed. The boy who once trembled in the face of shadows now sat long hours by the fire, a knife in hand, whittling wood into small figures. His face was calmer, his eyes distant, as though he were seeing something only he could understand. When he did speak, it was measured, deliberate, words chosen with care. Childhood had slipped from him quietly in those mountains, and what remained was someone older, harder, yet also steadier. One evening, as twilight seeped through the cracks of the shutters and supper sat cooling on the table, the silence between them grew heavy, so heavy Elias knew he could not leave it unbroken. He set down his fork, the scrape of metal on wood unnaturally loud in the quiet. He looked across at the boy, whose head was bowed, whose shoulders seemed too slight for the weight he carried. "Ethan," Elias began, his voice low and careful, like a man approaching a wounded animal. "I know what's on your mind. I know what you saw." The boy's spoon stilled. He did not look up, only whispered, "It's okay, Elias. You did what you had to do." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with the effort of holding something far heavier. Elias's chest tightened. "No, son, it isn't okay. Killing never is, but sometimes—" He paused, the words rough, reluctant to leave his throat. "Sometimes it's the only way left to protect the people we love." His eyes burned, his voice catching with the weight of his confession. Slowly, Ethan lifted his gaze. His eyes, still young but no longer childish, held something Elias had not seen before. Understanding. Not perfect understanding, not the kind that came with years, but enough to see the sorrow etched into Elias's face, enough to know the cost had been steep. "I'm not scared anymore," Ethan said softly, his voice steady now, almost defiant. "Not of them. Not of anyone. You showed me how to be strong. You showed me how to fight back. Thank you, Elias." The words pierced Elias deeper than any bullet could. They were simple, plain, but they carried a truth that washed over him like cool water over a fevered brow. He reached across the rough wooden table, his hand closing over Ethan's. His fingers, calloused and worn, enveloped the boy's smaller ones in a grip that was firm, protective, unyielding. It was not just a gesture of comfort, it was a vow, renewed and unspoken, that he would see the boy safely into a future where such strength would no longer be needed. They sat that way for a long time, hand in hand, the silence no longer oppressive but binding, the kind of silence that sealed promises stronger than words. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the creek whispered its eternal song, a reminder that life flowed on, indifferent to the battles fought by men. The past lay behind them like a scar, ugly, painful, but healed enough to allow life to continue. The future stretched before them, unknown and uncertain, but in that moment it did not matter. What mattered was the now, the boy who was no longer afraid, and the man who had found a reason to live again. In the quiet solitude of their small home, they had found a peace neither of them had believed possible. For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, they were not running, not hiding, not fighting. They were simply together. And in that togetherness, they discovered that even scarred souls could find rest, that even hearts weighed down by sorrow could still find light. The following months passed like a long, deep breath, a season of stillness after storms. The land itself seemed to sense the shift. Where once the valley had been a refuge for the hunted, it now became a place of slow healing, a balm upon the scars of two weary souls. The mornings were filled with the clatter of tools, the scrape of saw against timber, the rhythmic thud of hammer against nail. Smoke curled gently from the chimney each evening, not as a signal of survival, but as the mark of a home finding its heartbeat. Every stone laid, every wall raised, seemed to strip away another shadow of the past. Elias and Ethan devoted themselves to the work. The homestead, once skeletal and unfinished, grew into a structure of strength and permanence. The walls, thick and weatherproof, rose proudly against the wind. The roof, sturdy and well-sealed, held back the rain and snow. Each nail driven into the boards carried with it a piece of their resolve. By the time winter's first frost dusted the ground, the house was no longer a refuge cobbled together in haste, but a testament to their endurance, a living symbol that they had survived and rebuilt. Together, they cleared land for planting. The soil, dark and rich beneath the grass, welcomed their efforts. With calloused hands they bent to the earth, pulling weeds, turning soil, laying seeds. Under the warmth of the sun, they planted rows of beans, corn, and potatoes. To sow a garden was an act of quiet defiance, a declaration that violence and fear would not dictate their future. Each seed was a promise of growth, of continuity, of life beyond pain. Ethan, with dirt smudging his cheeks, would pause sometimes to smile faintly, as if realizing that for the first time he was planting not only food, but roots, his roots. Elias continued to teach the boy, but the lessons had shifted. The rifle, once a tool of war and defense, was introduced anew with gentler purpose. Elias taught Ethan to lift it, not to kill men, but to provide, to hunt with reverence. They spent long days tracking deer through the forest, pausing to read broken twigs and hoofprints in the mud. Elias showed him how to gut and clean a rabbit swiftly, to use hide for warmth and bone for tools, to waste nothing. These lessons were not only about skill, but about respect for the land, for life, for the balance of survival. Ethan absorbed it all with a patient, hungry focus. The boy who had once been fragile, trembling beneath the weight of abandonment, was transforming. Each new skill became another stone in the foundation of his independence. He no longer looked like a child clinging to safety. He was shaping himself into a young man capable of standing on his own. His silence carried less fear now and more thoughtfulness, a measured patience that came from knowing he belonged to the land, and that the land, in turn, belonged to him. Their evenings were spent by the fire, voices soft and steady as they spoke of what was to come. They discussed plans for spring, expanding the garden, raising livestock, building a smokehouse. They talked of the books Elias still carried, stories that brought laughter and reflection, tales that reminded them there was more to life than hardship. The conversations were never grand speeches but simple exchanges, steady as the ticking of time. It was in these quiet talks that they both began to imagine a future unshackled from the violence that had once defined them. But peace, no matter how deeply built, was fragile. One afternoon, while the two of them worked in the garden beneath a wide, forgiving sky, Ethan broke the silence. His hands stilled in the soil, his eyes lifting slowly to Elias. There was a gravity in his gaze, a seriousness that carried more weight than his years should have allowed. His voice, low and hesitant, trembled with something deeper than fear. "Elias," he murmured, almost as if afraid the wind might carry the words too far. I think I remember. About the gold." The word struck Elias like a bullet. He froze mid-motion, the hoe slipping from his hand and sinking into the earth with a dull thud. His heart lurched against his ribs, pounding with a sudden, frantic rhythm. He turned, searching Ethan's face. For months he had convinced himself the gold no longer mattered, that it was a ghost lost to the desert. He had believed Ethan's innocence, believed the boy when he said he had no part in it. And yet here it was, the shadow rising again. "What do you remember, son?" Elias asked, his voice taut, almost strained, each word dragged from a place of dread. Ethan's gaze dropped back to the soil, his fingers sifting absently through the dirt, as though grounding himself. Then, with quiet, measured resolve, he began to speak. His words painted the night he had carried inside him all these years. He spoke of his father, Silas, and the Dutchman, their voices raised in rage, fists clenched around something more than anger. He spoke of a leather pouch, heavy, bulging with weight. He remembered shouting, the violence that filled their home like smoke. "They were fighting over it," Ethan said, his voice growing firmer, conviction threading through each syllable. "And my mama, she saw it too. She saw him hide it. She told me to run, to just run and never stop. But before I left, she told me where he put it. She told me the place." When he lifted his eyes again, they were wide, almost haunted, as though revealing the memory had awakened something long buried. His young face, still touched with boyhood, was lit with a terrible knowledge no child should carry. He hid it in a place only she knew, a place where we used to go when things were too bad, when we needed to get away from him. It was our place, she told me. She made me promise to remember. Elias felt a chill coil in his stomach, a dread colder than winter winds. The gold was not rumor or shadow, it was real, tangible, a fortune heavy enough to poison the world around it. And the boy, this boy he had fought to protect, held the key to its resting place. That knowledge was more dangerous than any outlaw's bullet. It was a brand burned into Ethan's memory, one that had already drawn blood, and might draw more if it ever reached the wrong ears. "Where is it, Ethan?" Elias asked, his voice low, his throat tight with fear he could not show. The boy's lips parted, and for a long breath he did not answer. Then, steady and solemn, he spoke. "It's in the desert, Elias, in a place called the Serpent's Tooth, a rock formation. My mama said he buried it there in a hollow no one would ever find." The words fell heavy between them, sealing a truth that could not be undone. Elias knew the Serpent's Tooth. Every rancher, every drifter who had crossed that desert knew of it. A jagged spire of stone rising like the fang of some buried monster, a place men whispered about with equal parts reverence and fear. A place where men went to vanish, where the land itself could kill. Elias stared at the boy, at the courage etched across his small, solemn face. Ethan had already endured more than most men, had faced gangs, blood, and death. Yet this new truth was heavier still. The valley around them was peaceful, the bird song, the rustling of the breeze in the grass, the neat rows of their garden. But Elias understood in that moment that their peace was only borrowed. The gold was not gone. It was waiting, festering in the desert, calling out to every desperate man who sought fortune in blood. And so long as it remained, they were not safe. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, his eyes fixed on the boy who had become his son. He knew what had to be done. They could not leave it. They could not hope it would stay forgotten. The gold was a curse, and the only way to end it was to confront it, to face the desert, and to bury the past once and for all. The decision to go after the gold was not made lightly. It was the kind of choice that lived in the marrow, that turned over in the quiet hours of night when sleep refused to come. Elias wrestled with it for days, weighing it against every promise he had ever made to himself and to the boy who had become his son. He had sworn to protect Ethan, sworn that the boy would never again know the sharp edge of fear or the cruel hand of men. Yet the gold loomed like a shadow at the edge of their peace, a constant invisible presence, pulling unseen strings. So long as it remained in the world, buried in secrecy, it was a beacon for violence, a magnet for greed. One day, perhaps not soon but someday, others would come hunting for it and they would find Ethan. Elias knew he could not allow that. If peace was to last, the gold had to be found, and it had to be dealt with once and for all. The morning they left, the valley was hushed beneath a thin veil of mist. Dawn's first light washed the peaks in silver, and the air carried the crisp chill of early autumn. They rode out in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said in the glances they exchanged, in the unspoken vow that they carried together. Their faces were grim, their bodies taut with the weight of what lay ahead. The mountains fell away behind them, their green slopes and whispering pines giving way to the endless sweep of desert. For days they rode across the barren expanse, their horses plodding under the pitiless sun. The land stretched flat and unbroken, save for the low shimmer of mirages that wavered like false promises. The heat pressed down on them until every breath burned, until the line between earth and sky blurred into a haze of gold and white. Sand lashed their faces, scouring like knives when the wind rose, yet Elias was in his element. The land, harsh as it was, held no secrets from him. He read it like a book. A faint trace of moisture meant a hidden spring. The shadow of a circling hawk pointed to prey below. When the horses needed water, he found it in narrow gullies where trickles seeped from stone. When their food ran low, he set snares and found rabbits or birds, teaching Ethan with each careful step how to survive in places where most men would wither. He was a force of nature, not because he conquered the desert, but because he bent to its rhythm, moving with it rather than against it. Ethan rode at his side, quiet but unwavering. His determination was written in the set of his jaw, in the fixed way his eyes clung to the horizon. He did not complain when the sun scorched his skin or when thirst hollowed his throat. The boy who once trembled at shadows now carried himself with the solemn patience of a man. He knew the journey was not only about the gold, it was about facing the ghosts of his past, about proving that he was no longer hunted prey, but someone who could ride toward danger without flinching. At last, after endless days of heat and silence, the serpent's tooth rose from the desert, like the jagged bones of some ancient beast. Its twisted spires of red stone curled upward into the sky, resembling the fangs of a monster half buried in the earth. It loomed over the empty wasteland, casting long, menacing shadows. The sight of it tightened Elias's chest. This was the place. They dismounted, their boots crunching against gravel and sand as they led their horses into the shadow of the rocks. The air felt different here, heavier, as though the land itself remembered what had been hidden in its veins. Elias began to search, his eyes sharp, his hands brushing across stone and sand. He moved with a deliberate patience, scanning every hollow, every shadowed crevice. Ethan stood nearby, his gaze fixed downward, as if afraid that looking too closely might summon the past itself. Then Elias's hand struck something solid. He froze, fingers digging deeper into the sand until they touched cold steel, the edge of an old, half-buried shovel. His breath caught. He pulled it free, rust flaking off the handle. The shovel was no random relic. It marked the spot. His pulse hammered as he began to dig, the sand giving way beneath his hands with each fierce stroke. Ethan edged closer, his eyes widening with each clump of dirt thrown aside. At last, the earth gave up its secret. A heavy leather pouch emerged, swollen and bulging with its burden. Elias heaved it from the ground and the weight staggered him. He pulled the tie loose, and with a rough shake, a river of gold coins spilled across the sand. The sun struck them, and the desert blazed as if lit by fire. The sight was blinding, surreal, as though they had unearthed a treasure from some legend rather than the cursed spoils of blood. Elias stared, his breath caught in his throat. It was more than he had ever imagined, more than any man could rightfully spend in a lifetime. It was power, wealth, corruption, all gleaming in the open air. A fortune that had driven men mad, that had spilled blood and torn lives apart, including Ethan's. Ethan stepped forward, his face pale, eyes wide with awe and dread. It's real," he whispered. His voice carried thin on the desert wind. Elias nodded slowly. His heart ached as though pierced. He looked from the gold to the boy and back again. In that moment, the truth was carved into his soul. They could never keep it. The gold was poison. To carry it was to invite death, to invite every cruel and greedy soul in the territory into their lives again. It was not freedom. It was a chain. Without hesitation, Elias began to gather the coins, shoving them back into the pouch, forcing the gleam back into the dark. Ethan watched, silent, as Elias pushed the fortune back into the ground from which it came. They buried it deeper than before, piling stone upon stone, sealing it away forever. When it was done, Elias stood, his face hard but calm. "It stays here," he said simply, his voice low and steady. "It belongs to no one." They mounted again and rode away, leaving the serpent's tooth behind them. They did not look back. The desert swallowed the secret once more, silent and merciless, a tomb for the greed of men. Their return journey felt different. Their movements were slower now, not out of exhaustion but out of release. They had gone to war with the past and buried it. They rode as men who had crossed a threshold, who had faced temptation and walked away. They were not rich, but they were free. They carried no fortune in their saddlebags, but they carried something far greater, the bond of survival, the weight of truth, the promise of a life lived without shadows. When at last the mountains rose again, when the green slopes of their hidden valley came into sight, they felt as though they were entering a new world. The small house, the barn, the creek, they welcomed them home like old friends. Their hands went back to work, steady and sure, building, planting, repairing. Each motion was a hymn to peace, to the life they had chosen. No longer were they merely a rancher and a boy bound by circumstance. They were a family, and in that family they had found their freedom. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson and gold behind the peaks, they sat on the porch of their homestead, coffee warm in their hands. The world stretched vast and silent around them, but silence no longer meant loneliness. It meant peace. Elias looked at Ethan, and Ethan looked back, and without speaking they both understood. The war was finished, the hunt was over, and a new chapter had begun. A chapter written not in fear or in blood, but in the simple rhythm of living, of loving, of building something that would endure. Years passed, not in haste, but in the long, patient unfolding of seasons, each one leaving its mark upon the land and upon the two souls who had claimed it. Winters arrived with their heavy snows, blanketing the valley in silence, testing the strength of walls and the endurance of the hearth. Springs followed with floods of color, the earth awakening with wildflowers, the creek swollen and laughing with new water. Summers burned hot and dry, the sun pressing down upon the cattle and fields with relentless force, while autumn brought the rustle of leaves and the gathering of harvest. Time flowed not like a rushing river, but like a steady stream winding its course, shaping rock and soil slowly, persistently, until even the hardest edges were softened. The small, secluded valley, once no more than a hiding place from the cruelty of men, had ripened into something greater. A thriving ranch, a kingdom of peace carved by calloused hands, steady backs, and unyielding will. It bore the marks of sweat and patience, of countless days spent repairing, mending, and planting. What was once a haven of desperation had become a monument of perseverance. The sounds of life there formed a kind of music, a symphony that played endlessly but never tired the ear. The deep, resonant lowing of cattle drifting across wide pastures, the creak and groan of the windmill turning faithfully, drawing lifeblood water from the earth, the contented hum of bees among the sunflowers and clover, their song a hymn of quiet abundance. Even the silence of the valley carried a weight, a fullness, as if the land itself sighed in relief, glad to belong to men who asked nothing but honest living. The miner's shack had grown into a weathered barn, its walls lined with tools and hay, while the once unfinished homestead had risen into a two-story house, sturdy and proud. Its porch faced westward, catching every evening sunset as though it were a gift delivered only to them. Upon this porch, Elias sat. The years had etched their story across his body. His hair, once dark and thick, now gleamed silver under the sun, and the deep creases along his face told of battles fought, storms endured, and nights of reflection by the fire. His hands, scarred and calloused, no longer spoke only of hardship. They carried a new softness, the kind born from gentleness, given and received. His rocking chair creaked with each slow rhythm, but it was not the weary rest of a broken man. It was the contented sway of someone who had found peace after a lifetime of unrest. He was no longer the haunted figure who had once lived only to outlast pain. He was a father. His legacy was not the graves of men he had buried, but the life he had nurtured, the quiet dignity of a man who had chosen love over bitterness. From across the pasture came Ethan, no longer the trembling child who once clutched at Elias's coat, but a man grown tall and strong, his stride long and purposeful. He walked with the easy balance of someone who had spent his life in open country, every step sure, every motion a reflection of his bond with the land. His face, once gaunt with fear, had filled with strength. The shadows in his eyes had softened into depth, a quiet knowledge of suffering endured, but not surrendered to. He carried scars no one could see, yet bore them without shame, turning them into something that shaped him but did not bind him. His confidence was not loud, not brash, but steady, like the mountains that surrounded them. He was a man who had learned to live and to love, who had found that resilience was not only in surviving, but in choosing joy when joy seemed impossible. He would inherit the ranch not only in name, but in spirit. His hands were already skilled. They knew the patience of mending fences, the urgency of pulling a calf into the world, the keen attention needed to watch the sky for storms or drought. His soul was equally tempered, forged in fire but cooled in love, as unyielding as the stones beneath the valley creek. One day he would take over fully, marry, raise children who would run barefoot through the fields, climb the barn rafters, and learn to fish in the clear stream. Those children would grow free, untouched by the nightmares of their father's youth, living in a valley where the past's shadows could never reach. That evening they sat side by side on the porch, the land before them bathed in the glow of a sun setting into fire. Neither spoke for a long time, and neither needed to. The silence was rich with memory and meaning, thick with all the unspoken words of a life built together. The past still lived within them. Yes, it had shaped them, but it no longer defined them. The cursed gold, buried deep in the desert where it belonged, was nothing but dust and memory now, forgotten by the world, powerless to stir greed again. The treasure that mattered was here. It was in the meals eaten across the same small table, in the laughter that once seemed foreign but now rose naturally in their home. It was in the quiet glances exchanged as they worked shoulder to shoulder, a language of trust that needed no words. It was in the bond between a man once broken by war and a boy once shattered by cruelty. Two souls who had healed one another by building a life where there had once been none. The sky deepened into bruised purples and molten oranges, the kind of colors that stole breath and left only awe. Stars began to prick the horizon, timid at first, then bold, as though heaven itself was lighting candles in tribute. The night came gently, laying its hand upon the valley with kindness. Ethan turned, his face lit by starlight, his eyes carrying gratitude so profound it was almost painful to see. "Thank you, Elias," he said, his voice steady now, strong as a man's but still bearing the echo of the boy who had once whispered in fear. Elias did not reply with speeches. He did not need to. He simply nodded, eyes fixed on the young man, his heart swelling with pride and peace. Words were too small, too fragile to hold the truth between them. That truth lived in every day they had shared, in every moment they had survived, in every choice to love instead of hate. The last light of the sun vanished. Darkness spread, but it was not a darkness to fear. For them, the world was not empty. It was full, filled with the glow of 1,000 remembered mornings, the laughter of countless evenings, the promise of every sunrise still to come. The valley whispered around them in the voice of crickets, in the low hum of the creek, in the deep silence of the mountains. The war was behind them. The shadows could not reach them here. Ahead lay only peace, hard won, dearly paid for, but theirs forever.